Welcome, everyone. I'm Susan Elliott, President and CEO of the National Committee on American Foreign Policy. And I want to thank all of you for joining us for today's important discussion on chemical, biological, and nuclear weapons. Can the West deter Russia from using them? We're very excited to welcome a diverse group of participants today, including foreign policy experts, disarmament advocates, and scientific community representatives. It's a pleasure for us to have all of you joining us today. You know, 3 days into the Ukrainian war on February 27th, President Putin ordered Russia's nuclear deterrent forces to be put on high alert, sending an existential panic throughout Europe and the international community. As the war enters its second month of fighting, US intelligence officials have warned of the possibility of Russia escalating their military actions. And recently, on March 11th, Russian media outlets also accused the US of funding and harboring biological weapons facilities in Ukraine. The Kremlin's misinformation campaign has signaled to Russia watchers and intelligence officials that President Putin could be sharing false information to justify his own intention to authorize chemical, biological, or possibly a small tactical nuclear weapon use. In addition, on Friday, April 1, the US imposed further sanctions on North Korea for launching two ICBM missile testing. Under these revelations, can the US keep a divided attention on Europe and Asia? Quite a challenge. And can we feel assured that the world is safe from chemical weapons use or even a tactical nuclear weapon deployment, whether it be in Ukraine or beyond? And regarding Russia, how might Western countries and allies prevent, mitigate, or respond to such an attack? How could NATO, the US, and allies also respond while trying to prevent further escalation and, to be honest, try to prevent this from happening? So we hope to have a great discussion today of these questions. And before I introduce our panelists, I would just like to make a few technical points. If you have a question during today's discussion for the panelists, we ask that you use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen and not the chat function. And I will read the questions during the Q&A portion of the program. And hopefully, if we can, we will try to get through all of your questions. So please feel free to, to type them into the Q&A box. As a reminder, the webinar is being recorded and is on the record and will be made available online on our website and on the NCAFP YouTube channel in the coming days. Now I'd like to introduce to you our panelists for today's discussion. I'll start first with Andy Weber, who's a senior fellow at the Council on Strategic Risks at Janine E. Nolan Center on Strategic Weapons. Mr. Weber has dedicated his professional life to countering nuclear, chemical, and biological threats and to strengthening global health security. He has decades of U.S. government service, including 5.5 years as the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Nuclear, Chemical, and Biological Defense Program at the Pentagon. He was also the driving force behind the Nunn-Lugar cooperative threat reduction efforts to remove weapons-grade uranium from Kazakhstan and Georgia and nuclear-capable MiG-29 aircraft from Moldova to reduce biological weapons threats and to help destroy Libyan and Syrian chemical weapons stockpiles. Prior to joining the Pentagon as an advisor for threat reduction policy, Mr. Weber was posted as a U.S. Foreign Service officer in Saudi Arabia, Germany, Kazakhstan, and Hong Kong. And that's how I know Andy. So I've known him for a long time as a colleague and a great Foreign Service friend. And we also have Ankit Panda, who is the Stanton Senior Fellow in Nuclear Policy at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Ankit is an expert in Asia-Pacific region. His research interests range on nuclear strategy, arms control, missile defense, nonproliferation, emerging technologies, and U.S. extended deterrence. He's the author of Kim Jong-un and the Bomb, Survival and Deterrence in North Korea. And he also has consulted for the United Nations in New York and Geneva on nonproliferation and disarmament matters. And aside from his numerous fellowships and association, he's a widely published author and frequent speaker at events and conferences. And I'm also pleased to say that he's been a great participant in many of the NCAFP's Forum on Asia Pacific Security events. So now that you see we have such a distinguished panel, I think I'd like to start out with maybe just a little background. There are many treaties and international agreements that oversee this, the use of both chemical, biological, and nuclear weapons. But I'm wondering, maybe I'd start out with you, Andy, because you're an expert in this area and especially worked on this at the Pentagon. What would it mean if Russia, or even more broadly, if we look at this problem as an international one, if some place like North Korea decided to use a chemical weapon? What does that mean in terms of the international community and the Chemical Weapons Convention?
Well, certainly, the Chemical Weapons Convention bans the possession and use of any chemical weapon. So, were North Korea to have, as we saw in the Kuala Lumpur airport attack, where a VX nerve agent was used to kill Kim Jong Un's half brother, Kim Jong Nam, they're in violation of the Chemical Weapons Convention, and it would be crossing a threshold to the use of weapons of mass destruction, and the international response would be extremely strong.
And what would you think would the international response if Russia, say, were to use a chemical weapon in Ukraine? I'm thinking about, could there be more of an international response than we've already seen from the sanctions and what's currently been happening?
Yes, I think it would be a very strong response. Russia is also in flagrant violation of the Chemical Weapons Convention, as we saw when they used Novichok, fourth generation chemical weapons agents in Salisbury in an assassination. So I would think if they were to cross the threshold to any use of weapons of mass destruction, including banned biological and chemical weapons, that as President Biden has said, the consequences would be severe.
Yeah. And Ankit, you're a nuclear expert, and what are your thoughts on, just in general, use of tactical nuclear weapons, and what would be obviously the consequences if whether Russia or North Korea or any country that possesses nuclear weapons were to use them?
Also, let me begin by saying, we're obviously fortunate to not have seen the combat use of nuclear weapons since 1945. I think it's a very different kind of picture with chemical weapons, especially given the slackening norm, one might say, in recent years, given what Andy just described with North Korea's use, Russia's use. With nuclear weapons, we thankfully don't have a similar precedent. In fact, we haven't seen an atmospheric nuclear detonation on Earth since October 1980. That was the last atmospheric nuclear test conducted by China. And so any use of nuclear weapons would be a dramatic escalation in this crisis. I can think of no militarily justifiable use of nuclear weapons against any target that might be of interest to Russia in this ongoing conflict. There are, of course, a range of other considerations here, which is tactical nuclear weapons are often described as a small nuclear weapon, to which I would just say that there's really nothing small about even Russia's smallest warheads. As far as I know, based on open source information, Russia's smallest nuclear warheads are on the order of 10 kilotons. If we compare that, for instance, to the largest conventional weapons that exist in the US arsenal, for instance, the United States operates the world's largest conventional bomb. The yield there is 11 tons. And so you're talking several orders of magnitude difference in terms of explosive power. And so I think it goes without saying that any use of nuclear weapons in this conflict would be militarily unwarranted, a tremendous escalation. Fortunately, I think the risk of Russia resorting to the use of nuclear weapons, in my estimation, still remains remote. I do have a lot more concerns about chemical weapons in particular. But these are, I think, some of the issues that loom large. And then, Susan, you brought up the norms and binding laws that we have around these things, and to which I would just bring up the Non-Proliferation Treaty with 191 states parties, extended indefinitely in 1995. Russia, I think, has a particular responsibility as a member of the so-called nuclear weapon states to behave responsibly when it comes to its use of nuclear weapons or threats to use nuclear weapons. Unfortunately, I think what we've seen from President Putin in pretty much the very early moments of this conflict has already shown that I think Russia is behaving in ways when it comes to nuclear weapons that really are out of sync with those obligations. And actually, it was just earlier this year in January that all members of the P5, including Russia, signed a statement saying that nuclear weapons should not be used because a nuclear war cannot be won. And I think what we're seeing now in the midst of this conflict, with the temptation in Russia to saber rattle using nuclear weapons, is really, I think, quite dangerous.
Well, and I would agree, and I think that's a really good point. And maybe, in just exploring this a little bit further, Andy, what do you think? I think Ankit has a really good point, but we did hear that Russia is on nuclear alert, and how serious? Because you have a very long and broad experience in dealing with Russia post-Soviet Union. How real do you think that threat is, and what would we be able to do, at least diplomatically, to try to make sure that Russia doesn't make good on any threat like that?
Well, while I certainly agree that Russia's use of banned chemical or biological weapons is more likely than the use of a nuclear weapon, I think it is a very real threat. And there's a paradox here. The worse the war goes for Russia, the more likely that Putin is going to lash out with weapons of mass destruction, including possibly nuclear weapons. And I agree, there's no such thing as a small nuclear weapon. Um, we talk about them in a way that makes them seem very vanilla and antiseptic, but these are nuclear weapons comparable to the ones that the United States dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
Sorry, I had myself on mute. And what would you think then? Obviously, we want to deter Russia from using any kind of chemical, biological, or nuclear weapon. But do you have any thoughts? It seems as though, as you mentioned, the conflict isn't going well for Russia. And what can the West, or even as a former diplomat, that the diplomatic community could do? Are there ways? Because obviously we don't want to have to respond. Although that's a question: is how should we respond if that happens? But are there ways that you think that we could work diplomatically to try to avoid this kind of Russian use of either chemical or nuclear weapons?
Well, deterrence is the first priority, of course. But I think we should continue to do what we've been doing artfully since the beginning, even before this unprovoked invasion of Ukraine. And that is to continue to reveal our intelligence on the planning for the use of chemical weapons, biological weapons, or nuclear weapons, making it public, perhaps privately in more detail, as a way to preempt use. And then the other thing we can do, especially when it comes to biological weapons and chemical weapons, is enhance preparedness on the ground. And we've been doing that. We've been providing the Ukrainian health ministry and defense ministry with detection equipment, with protective gear, and with medical countermeasures to save lives in the use, but also as part of our deterrence policy, because if our adversary, in this case Russia, believes that these weapons won't be successful as a weapon of mass destruction because of our preparedness, then they would think twice about using them.
I think it's a really good point, because on the one hand, you want the Ukrainians to be successful, but as we mentioned, if Putin feels that he's not meeting the objectives that he had for starting the conflict, that he might be tempted. And I wonder, Ankit, your thoughts on ways again to deter, and what should be done. I know that President Biden said that we would take very strong measures if any kind of chemical or biological weapon would be used. But what are your thoughts on not only deterrence, but even what would we do if in fact a chemical or biological weapon were used?
I think the president's been smart to not commit himself to any particular course of action, but to indicate that the response would be swift and severe. I think ultimately, this would force a concerted response from the NATO alliance, even though NATO is not yet a party to this conflict directly. I think these conversations have been happening within the alliance. We've heard the Secretary General indicate the seriousness with which NATO views this. I think throughout this conflict, of course, we've seen policymakers, our policymakers in particular, recognize the risks of uncontrollable escalation, which has been part of the reason that NATO hasn't yet gotten directly involved, despite providing tremendous support to Ukraine. I fully agree with Andy that if we think of the two modalities of deterrence as deterrence by punishment, where after the bad thing happens, you punish the aggressor, or deterrence by denial, with chemical weapons in particular, I think focusing on denial, i.e. making it clear to Russia that they cannot use chemical weapons to great military advantage. Because I think despite the common perception that chemical weapons are this wanton product of mass destruction, they are perceived by militaries historically to have useful uses on the battlefield. And so more we can blunt those perceived advantages to the Russian military and deprive them of any incentives to actually resort to these weapons, I think that's really where most of these efforts should be focused right now. Hopefully it doesn't have to come to the point where we would be called then to punish Russia, because ultimately I think in that case, deterrence would already have failed. And our options in terms of punishing the Russian military directly, of course, I think are quite limited, given, I think, the well-placed concerns about military escalation between NATO and Russia. But I think so far the messaging, what our policymakers have been doing, what the White House has been saying, and of course the assistance we've been providing Ukraine has really been spot on in recognition of this real threat.
I think those are really good points. And I'm wondering, we mentioned as part of what Russian media has been reporting is that that the Ukrainians had biological and chemical weapons, or at least facilities to produce those. And I'm wondering, are there ways that we could counteract that kind of information? And I don't know if you have thoughts on that, even on deterrence. How can we assure people that those kinds of things aren't true, and that we are, where that can't be a reason for part of Russia's justification for doing what they're doing?
Well, this disinformation campaign, which is not new, it's been going on for over a decade. But what's changed is, instead of using press plants through cooperative journalists in Bulgaria, et cetera, it's now risen to the official level, where it's even in the joint statement during the Olympics by Putin and Xi, making these ridiculous accusations. So I think we need to just counter with the truth. And the truth is very clear, that the United States is in full compliance with the Biological and Toxin Weapons Convention and the Chemical Weapons Convention, and doesn't have any of these. And Ukraine has always been in compliance with its international obligations vis-a-vis the CWC and the BWC. In fact, the truth is, and this is what's so rich about these accusations, Russia, according to the annual State Department report, is in violation of both of these international conventions. So this is a case of the pot calling the kettle black. And it's really rich that the head of the Russian Ministry of Defense nuclear, chemical, biological, radiological defense forces, General Igor Kirillov, he's the one making these accusations, when he oversees much of Russia's illegal chemical and biological weapons work. In fact, he owns three top secret military biological laboratories in Russia that have never been visited by outside observers. They've never had any inspections, and in fact, they were sanctioned last year by the in the tail end of the Trump administration, um, just for that reason. So it's Russia that's in violation, and we need to be clear and forthright and keep repeating that because truth is on our side.
I think that's a really good point. And Keith, I'm wondering, Andy mentioned, the statement that President Putin and Xi made, on the margins of the Olympics. Do you think that China could play a role, because you're an Asia expert, but China could play a role in trying to dissuade Russia from be a deterrent, using any kind of chemical or nuclear weapon? I know that we're, I think, hoping that China, at least economically and other ways, according to the sanctions, would play a role. But what do you think in this arena? Could China play a role in trying to help deter the Russians from using any chemical or biological weapons?
So, I think unfortunately what we've seen over the course of the last 6 weeks and going back earlier to early February in the Putin-Xi joint statement is that China and Russia are really standing shoulder to shoulder. I think in the immediate moments after the war started, Beijing did appear to be caught a little off guard by the fact that the Russians proceeded with their invasion. But since then, I think China has recalibrated and decided that in the current moment, its interests are best served by aligning fully with Russia. The other thing I'll say is that based on everything that we're observing externally, and of course there's a lot here that we can't see about what exactly the Chinese and the Russians are telling each other behind closed doors, for instance, it does appear to be that China has very limited influence in sort of, first of all, telling Vladimir Putin directly what he should or should not be doing when it comes to military maneuvers and escalation in Ukraine. And so that leads me to then conclude that I probably don't see a real role here for Beijing in terms of dissuading Russia, unfortunately, from choosing to escalate with the use of chemical weapons. I think it is interesting and again unfortunate that we've seen Chinese officials and Chinese state media amplify Russian disinformation. Allegedly, I think this could also serve to help cover up Russian escalation if they do choose to use chemical weapons. But right now, I think it's also quite possible that China simply is assessing that the probability that Russia will resort to the use of these weapons is quite low. And again, I think as we saw with China's overall assessment of the situation in February, they may be wrong about that again. I don't think Beijing has any interest in seeing Russia escalate the use of weapons of mass destruction, but I also get the sense that this possibility is not being taken seriously enough in Beijing.
So you think that they don't need to intervene because they don't think it's a possibility, is basically,
I think so. Obviously, what I would like to see China do is obviously very different. I would like to see China fully condemn Russia for this aggression and recognize that its own aspirations for being a great power and a member of the international community in good standing would be better served by distancing itself from Moscow. But unfortunately, I don't think that view really is going to get any supporters in Beijing in the current political environment. I think President Xi has decided, unfortunately, that the current moment is somewhat existential in terms of the great power divisions between Russia, China, and the United States, and China has fully chosen to stand alongside Russia.
mhm. Yeah, that is, we did have a program last week about China-Russia relations, and yeah, it is unfortunate because I think China could play a very significant, helpful role if they decided they wanted to do it. One other aspect of, if you put aside the use of a chemical or nuclear weapon, but is the perhaps destruction or the protection of nuclear power plants in Ukraine. And we did see that the Russians took Chernobyl, but now it appears over the weekend they've given it back to the Ukrainians because there was some reports of Russian soldiers having signs of radiation sickness. So this is kind of a concern because, you know, what happened? Did they go into the excluded zone? Was there some kind of damage to the plant? And I wonder if there's a way that, again, we can deter. And I know maybe this is through the IAEA, but maybe, Andy, what are your thoughts on, do you think that could be something that Russia would consider doing rather than using a nuclear weapon, but cause some kind of an accident at a power plant, which then for plausible deniability, they could say, well, the Ukrainians did it.
Well, we've seen Russia acting recklessly in this regard. First, taking over the Chernobyl site, and then of even greater concern because Chernobyl, the last reactor there, was shut down 20 plus years ago. But they took over an active reactor site with 6 reactors in Zaporizhia and essentially took the reactor staff hostage. And they're operating those very potentially dangerous facilities at gunpoint and have been now for about a month. And it's unsustainable. So it's there are other reactors around Ukraine, and we hope that Russia doesn't attack those. It's not clear why they did this. Are they intending to shut off electricity to major cities? I mean, that reactor in Zaporizhia provides electricity. I think close to half of the country's electricity. So if they are intending to shut them down, it takes trained staff to do that safely and to avoid the risk of a meltdown. So it's another example of reckless behavior. The IAEA Director General, Rafael Grossi, has been great about trying to gain access to those facilities because he's very, very concerned, deeply concerned about safety.
I think I read over the weekend that he was hoping to or planning to try to visit some of those sites, and I don't know how feasible that would be, but it certainly might be, at least a deterrent or a help.
It would certainly help, but it's very complicated in the middle of a war zone. But let's hope. So he has to negotiate with both Russia and Ukraine to gain access. The request came last Friday, so let's hope he's able to do that.
And would you think that, these reports of people being exposed to radiation, which sounded like it was Russian military, it's just maybe them not understanding what they were doing? Or do you think there is a possibility that there could be some kind of a radiation issue at Zaporizhia or in that area?
I think those reports are unconfirmed, and I don't view them as very credible. While it is a hot zone, it's not that radioactive after 36 years. Although you do get a cumulative dose if you're camped out in the red forest there for well over a month. But I think those reports have yet to be confirmed.
Well, I'm wondering, Keith, if you could, we've talked a little bit about what President Biden has said, but even, and, of course, for Andy, this question as well, but what do you see in terms of Europe? Could Europe play? And we know that President Macron has spoken with Putin, but, especially in this area, the use of any kind of a chemical, biological, or, nuclear weapon would clearly affect not only the people of Europe, but could actually affect the people of Western Russia. Do you see any kind of actions that maybe the Europeans or other actors like India or we know that Turkey's been working on other kinds of diplomatic actions that might be a deterrent for the Russians?
Look, I think in terms of Europe, I mean, first of all, the members of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, I think, have been united in terms of speaking out that there's no role for the use of nuclear weapons, and the use of chemical weapons in particular would be seen as a serious escalation, which I think is absolutely the right thing to be done here. In terms of the ability of Western European leaders or the European Union or other countries around the globe, again, to I think weigh on Putin's decision making. I mean, I think there's Russia and then there's Vladimir Putin on some levels, right? So we see Russian diplomats obviously around the world and in global capitals carrying forward Russia's diplomatic position in line, but really Vladimir Putin himself appears to be, at least based on the reports that we've seen, quite mistrustful of his own advisors and quite isolated as a leader. So it seems dubious to me that really any other country or any entity, certainly outside of Russia, could could seriously dissuade Putin from taking these decisions. Which is not to say that Putin is behaving irrationally. I think in terms of understanding why Putin might be rational, I think it perhaps doesn't make sense to us why he wants the things that he does in the first place, why he believes Ukraine isn't a country, for instance. Um, so unfortunately, I think the kinds of deterrent signals that Russia would end up appreciating more are unlikely to be sort of delivered diplomatically. I think so. The kinds of messaging that we've seen from NATO, I think we've seen from President Biden in terms of indicating the seriousness of chemical weapons use as an escalation in this conflict, I think is prudent for the moment. And then again, to just foot stomp the earlier points that were raised on preparing the Ukrainians for if this does happen. I think that's again really important and can't really be overstated.
Yeah, I think that's something that hasn't really been widely broadcast in the media, but I think it is probably extremely important. And it kind of goes along with a question that I see that we've gotten is what is the U.S. NATO response to Russian use of a manned chemical weapon in Ukraine, and would it be sufficiently proportional yet avoid a spiral of escalation? I guess I would see this question to be is we did mention that President Biden said that there'd be a swift and strong reaction, but what would that reaction be? I mean, would that be especially because those weapons could then easily have detrimental effects for NATO allies, for example, Poland and others? And what could be done that wouldn't be a an escalation that would even be worse than the initial use? And it's like what you mentioned, Ankit, about no one wins a nuclear war. But what do you think that NATO and other Europeans might do in response um, to the use of a chemical weapon?
I think I frankly speaking, don't know what the response would be. I think the messaging that we've seen is that this would be obviously an escalation that is completely unwarranted and reckless, and there's no role for chemical, nuclear, or biological weapons here. Look, I mean, I think frankly speaking, there would be very difficult conversations within the alliance. I think different countries would have differing views on the appropriate response. I find it very difficult to imagine that even the use of chemical weapons would lead to direct NATO strikes on Russian forces in Ukraine, because at that point, NATO would become an active participant in this conflict, and the possibility of escalation has been something that I think Western leaders have taken quite seriously. That keeping NATO out of the line of fire is sort of the first priority. It could result in, I think, changes in the kinds of assistance, direct and indirect, that are being provided to the Ukrainians. For instance, I think there'd be a very strongly concerted effort to share intelligence with the Ukrainians on all of the Russian units that were operating or potentially likely to operate chemical weapons for delivery to their targets. And of course, there has been some of that cooperation already underway, as far as we've seen based on public reporting. But I could see that nature of cooperation again changing. But in terms of direct military reprisals against Russian forces, it's I think very unclear still if the alliance would agree that that was the proper course of action.
Do you have thoughts on that, Andy? Especially because, again, given the proximity to NATO allies, it could be seen as something that you'd have. It wouldn't be a direct attack, but a secondary attack, for example, with effects on Poland or other NATO allies.
Well, it would be the use of chemical weapons by the Russians would be escalatory, and it would only happen if it were approved by President Putin personally. So I think that it would be a major escalation to the use of weapons of mass destruction, and I'm not so sure that NATO would stay on the sidelines in that case. Um, Obviously, the quality of military assistance would continue to rise. Anti-ship missiles come to mind. There are a lot of things that we haven't provided yet that we could or should provide in that case. Um, it bears stating, because of all the disinformation, that the response would not be with chemical weapons, because NATO doesn't have chemical weapons.
Right.
But there are a lot of ways that we could increase the level of pain, ranging from diplomatic and economic sanctions to greatly increased military support, and possibly, I don't discount the possibility of NATO activity inside Ukraine in some capacity, perhaps in an advisory capacity.
Well, that I think that would make sense. We do have a couple questions here, and I would just encourage our audience, if you do have a question, to put it in the Q&A box, because we do have a little bit of time now where we can take questions from the audience. Another question, which is kind of interesting, and with the amount of physical destruction being portrayed in Ukraine right now, why would Russia feel the need to use a chemical or biological weapon? And of course, I guess my initial response would be because chemical and biological weapons don't destroy things as much as they destroy, people. But you have any thoughts on that? And again, what would be Putin's point of doing this? Either of you have any thoughts on that question?
Well, I think the point would be very similar to the absolute barbaric methods being used against soft targets. What we saw in Bucha after the Russian retreat, um, it would be to terrorize the population, to try to force a surrender. And chemical weapons are absolutely horrific. I think it's more likely they would be used against soft civilian targets than military targets, although we can't discount their use against military and civilian leadership targets. But I think it would be consistent with the way they're waging this war in the most barbaric manner, and it would just be an escalation of the terror that is already occurring.
Yeah, I largely agree with that. I think since the earliest moments of this war, I think it was clear that Vladimir Putin was expecting this campaign to go very differently. That he was expecting Ukrainian morale to completely break under the supremacy of the Russian armed forces, which obviously has not been the case. And so employing these weapons, crossing these thresholds, and psychologically, I think, tormenting the Ukrainian people, pressuring the Ukrainian leadership through the use of weapons of mass destruction, I think, could be one plausible political rationale beyond the military or perceived military utility of these weapons.
Well, one thing, and I know this sort of veers off a little bit from what we've been talking about, but Andy, you have experience of being a foreign service officer and a diplomat, and I'm just wondering if both of you could comment on, how, again, as a way of deterrence, that we could try to the sides to come to a diplomatic solution. We know that Turkey has been hosting diplomatic talks. I don't know how serious or what the outcomes would be, or even if they talked about the use of any kind of chemical or nuclear weapon. But do you have any thoughts on how we could work harder, maybe, to bring around a diplomatic solution to end the conflict?
Well, I think increasing the pressure, getting a country like India that's sitting on the fence to take a stronger or take a position, not in support of the Russian aggression, um, trying to influence China in that direction, although it's very, very difficult for the reasons that Ankit uh, described. But I think we do. I mean, one of the factors of dealing with a dictator like Putin, it's up to him. I mean, he can change his mind. So we need to keep those lines of communication through trusted intermediaries open to help convince him, especially if he's not getting the bad news, the reality of the war situation from his own advisors. We need to continue to communicate with leaders who are in direct communication with Putin, to keep delivering V's message and to let him know that he needs to change his course here.
Yeah, the only other thought that I would add to that is I think just as important as credible threats are to deterring action, so too I think are credible rewards to ending a conflict. And I know it obviously I think it's repulsive to many to think about the idea of rewarding Vladimir Putin with anything. But ultimately, Russia needs to feel that it has reasons to gain by accepting an outcome short of the war aims that Putin had stated on February 23rd, right as the conflict began. And it's clear that Russian war aims have shifted. I think that's especially apparent given the retreat around Kiev, although that might result in a new round of escalation after Russian forces have been able to refit. So that's one thought I would raise, because ultimately I think we are seeing the Russians frame this conflict increasingly in existential terms, that the West is sanctioning Russia in perpetuity with no sort of limited objective in mind, short of regime change. And I think it's important to avoid that perception. The other thing I'll say is that I think in the West it might become increasingly difficult to accept the kind of settlement that perhaps the Ukrainians themselves might want to end this conflict. I've seen a lot of commentary at some points chastising the Ukrainians for being willing to discuss things like neutrality, foregoing membership in NATO, potentially even territorial concessions. To which I'll just say, it's easy for me to dial into this from Washington and have my views about what the Ukrainians should do to terminate this conflict. But ultimately, I think it'll be up to President Zelensky and the Ukrainian people to decide exactly what costs might be tolerable to end this conflict and to prevent further suffering. And so I think supporting the Ukrainians in whatever negotiated solution they might choose to accept, again, I think will be quite important.
Well, and I think you brought up a good point that to me, a lot of this conflict goes back to Putin's feeling about NATO expansion and whether Ukraine could or should be a part of NATO. And I'm wondering, I know, I think it's I've heard this said, but it's easy to sit down with your friends, but in order to get resolution, you have to sit down with your enemies. And I'm wondering, do you think that would be an advantage if President Biden did talk to President Putin or tried to talk to him, or at least if Tony Blinken talked to Sergei Lavrov to try to, help the Ukrainians with coming to some kind of a solution? Because in the end, I think the Russians are going to want some kind of guarantees from the U.S. and other NATO allies for this. But what are your thoughts on that? I know a lot of people say, "Oh no, well that's like giving Putin a concession," but on the other hand, sometimes I think you have to talk with the people who you most disagree with. I don't know what your thoughts on that are, Andy.
Yeah, I agree. Communication is not a concession. And so I think we need to keep lines of communication open. One big factor here, we and the West in general have imposed very, very severe sanctions on the Russian Federation. Ukraine can't negotiate those off. So, clearly the West has to be part of this. If there is to be an off ramp for Putin, it needs to include the West in some way. So I always feel that keeping and having direct communication with a dictator like Putin during this time of conflict is very important.
Do you have any thoughts on that, Ankita? I was just thinking that because you said you sit in Washington, and I guess for me, I think it's always important, for leaders to meet. I like it when I see that President Biden, last year did speak with Putin in Geneva. He speaks with President Xi, and are your thoughts the same on that?
Yeah, I mean, fully agree that lines of communication in times of crisis are essential and shouldn't be thought of as a concession. The only thing I'll add is, in terms of the earlier discussion we were having about deterrence and escalation, I find it disturbing that General Milley hasn't had his Russian counterpart really pick up the phone
Yeah.
throughout these weeks of conflict, and perhaps the Russians see that as a way to engage in a bit of brinksmanship to tell the United States that because we don't have lines of communications open, that things might really get out of control if the U.S. were to step up its involvement in this conflict. But again, I think it should be communicated quite clearly to the Russians that we do have a mutual interest in maintaining these lines of communication. I think the point that Andy raises also about the West having its own measures that the Ukrainians have really no direct influence over is incredibly important. I think the more the Russians see this as a conflict that perhaps gets resolved locally in Ukraine, even if the final territorial status of Crimea and the Donbass remains in Russia's favor in some way, Putin might see no assurance that Western sanctions are going to come off anytime soon, because many of those sanctions were predicated. And look, I mean, we credibly followed up on a deterrent threat with the implementation of those sanctions. And what we've been telling the Russians is that those sanctions presumably would end if the territorial status quo pre-February 23rd were to be restored and all Russian forces were to leave Ukraine. But again, that's not an assurance that the Ukrainians can provide unilaterally at the negotiating table. So I think coordinating with the Ukrainians and among the West, among the various Western countries that have quite a range of views, right? The Baltic states, Poland have very different views from Germany, from France, from the United Kingdom, from the United States. And so making sure that we have a concerted, united front is, again, I think, going to be in the interest of Ukraine and in the interest of ensuring the best possible outcome for the Ukrainians in any negotiated settlement.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point that both of you make, is that even if the Ukrainians come to an agreement with the Russians, that's no guarantee that the sanctions would be taken off. So there's got to be coordination with Europe and with the United States. There's another question here which I think is a little bit different than we've discussed before, and it's what do you make of the news that the Russians are ready to attack Ukraine from other, not just Belarusia, but from Transnistria, which is, a disputed territory with Moldova? And could Georgia be the next in line for a Russian invasion, or Russians using other areas that they already have troops to help with the conflict? I know, Andy, former Soviet Union well, and what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think not in the near term for one reason, and not because there isn't desire on behalf of the Russian leadership, but the capability just isn't there. They are totally tapped out in this massive war they've launched on Ukraine. In fact, they're moving forces from South Ossetia and Abkhazia into Ukraine, so they just don't have the bandwidth to attack at this time other countries. Transnistria, which is on the border, the western border of Ukraine, it's part of Moldova. It's possible they could draw on some of the forces there, but again, they seem to be consolidating to eastern and southern Ukraine and pulling forces out of the west because of the harsh military defeat that they're facing.
Do you have any thoughts on that, Ankit?
Sorry, Susan, I missed the first part of your question. You were muted.
Okay, just so it's if you had any other thoughts on that, because I think the countries that surround the area are very worried about things like this.
Absolutely, I think it's possible to imagine a range of scenarios. I think the point about the amount of military capacity, the casualties the Russians have suffered, the amount that they've expended in terms of their conventional precision munitions, I think all of that is going to have long-term effects in Russia's ability to sustain military operations in its so-called near abroad, overseas, in the Middle East, and Syria. I think, unfortunately, another longer-term effect of this is that I think we will see a Russia that's going to become a lot more dependent on its so-called non-strategic nuclear weapons, which have been a longstanding concern for the United States. So I think those effects shouldn't be underestimated. I think the Russians really have found themselves suffering an unexpected setback over these last few weeks in Ukraine. So that's all I have to add to that. Thanks.
Well, and we've got an interesting question here, which I think is something to consider. It said, if this drags on and months from now we see continued Ukrainian military success, which with high levels of, U.S. and NATO material support, could we see Putin risking the escalation and or direct or specific threats of escalation rather than accepting a defeat? So it's kind of, if things go well, will that make, do either of you think that that would make Putin more likely to go ahead and use a weapon that he may not be considering using now?
I, I think so. I think that's the paradox here is as Putin loses this war, and it appears that with time he will continue to lose this war, given the fighting um, capabilities and bravery of Ukrainians who are fighting for their survival. Um, I do think that that is a real risk. That as he becomes more desperate, Ankit has said that the Russians are publicly defining this conflict more in existential terms, and indeed, as Ankit knows well, Russian military doctrine calls for the use of nuclear weapons in a so-called escalate to de-escalate manner if the existence of the state is threatened. And it could be that the way they're defining this, that between that and the economic sanctions biting, that they view it that way. And I think it's very important as President Biden rolls out the nuclear posture review, which states that the fundamental role of nuclear weapons is to deter nuclear attacks. We need to move away from this doctrine of fighting or preparing to fight limited nuclear wars. I think we have undermined our nuclear deterrence by in essence, mimicking some of Putin's military doctrine. Um, we don't want him to think that if he uses a so-called small nuclear weapon, that the response would be with a proportionate small nuclear weapon. I think just having these types of weapons in our arsenal actually undermines and weakens our deterrent against the use of nuclear weapons. So we need to move away with that. And I was also very satisfied to see that President Biden has decided to cancel the tactical nuclear sea launch cruise missile revival program that President Trump had initiated.
Yeah, I think those are very good points because I also, at least from my mind, the term escalate to de-escalate never really made sense to me. If you use a small nuclear um, bomb, does that mean that you won't get a response or you'll just get a small one back? I think it's flawed logic. I think we have just about time for one more question. Some of the other questions we've had are very similar to what have been asked, but one is, we talked about preparing the Ukrainians in Ukraine to be able to deal with a chemical or biological weapon response. But what about what we are doing, and is the U.S. considering preparing the people, especially for the non-NATO countries, of the possibility that they would also need to protect themselves in case of a nuclear or chemical attack? I don't know if either of you know any about that, but
Oh, I think absolutely, and this is happening. And NATO is increasing its we call it CBRN preparedness, um, deploying specialized military units and medical capabilities to deal with mass casualties from a CBRN event. And we can need to do more of this, both on the military side, but also on the civilian side, in order to be prepared and to enhance what we referred to as deterrence by denial, by having this preparedness. And we need it in place and ready to respond quickly because, especially a chemical attack, and that's one of the big differentiators between a chemical weapons attack and a biological weapons attack. With chemical weapons, the effects are immediate. So you need the antidotes on hand right away. Whereas a biological attack, because it's just the use of infectious disease, there's an incubation period of 4 to 7 or 10 days. So the effects are not as immediate as chemical weapons. So pre-deploying detection equipment so we can attribute the use and know that a use has happened immediately. And then the protective gear, including N95 masks, which are pretty effective against biological weapons threats. And then the medical countermeasures to respond quickly to save lives.
Yeah, I think you've raised really good points about especially the use of chemical weapons is that there isn't time to think about how to respond. You've got to respond immediately or else have devastating effects. Well, we're really just about out of time, but I want to thank both of you for, at least for me, helping me to think better about how we can do all that we can to deter the use of both biological, chemical, and nuclear weapons. And as a former diplomat, I hope that the U.S. and our other partners and allies, whether it be in India, Asia, Japan, others, really think about how we can work to try to bring this conflict to a close. It's There aren't any easy answers, and we've demonstrated that. But I think you both have brought up some really good points about how we can at least deter the use of chemical, biological, or nuclear weapons. So thanks to both of you for participating and for your support of our program. And we look forward to more discussions in the future.